Peter Ludlow, welcome back to NEOHUMAN Podcast after a few episodes.
Yeah, it's an honor to be back.
Yeah, I haven't done much because I honestly, I'm getting away from a routine of any kind. And if there is something interesting or someone interesting pops up, I'm more than happy and willing to talk. But there is no need to do like one a week or anything like that, because I think anything that needed to be said has been said already. You know, this is the age of experiencing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I hear you.
So for those of our audience who are not familiar with what you're doing, just a very quick introduction to who Peter Ludlow is according to Peter Ludlow.
Well, the last time I talked to you, I started out by talking about my formative years as a grad student in New York. And if you recall, I talked about how I had become impressed by this group of people downtown that were the filmmakers and the no-wave musicians, and the musicians became filmmakers, and the filmmakers became musicians.
The
And no one knew what
weirdos.
they were doing. What's that?
The
No way.
weirdos.
Yeah. Um, and then I said something about how that sort of got me going on this sort of intersection of linguistics and philosophy. And so that drives a lot of what I do, which is work on things that I don't know anything about, but I'm always sort of, for some reason, attracted to these areas where there are people coming from completely different fields. And it occurred to me after we talked about that that's exactly what's going on in this decentralized finance space, or this DeFi space, which is that you have this bunch of people sort of coming in from different areas. So you have the tech people coming in, you have the finance people coming in, and you have these legal people coming in too. So it's making for an interesting mix, and I'm glad you wanted to talk about these recent developments.
Yeah, we stayed in touch since the last time you were on, mainly about John McAfee, I think.
Yeah.
Sharing articles and stuff. But then
Yeah.
we also talk about DeFi, and then the whole GameStop thing happened. That
Right.
for most people, it just goes right above their head. They don't even want to know about it exactly because of that, because they don't want to say that, hey, we don't know what's going on. But it's such a revolutionary thing that is happening, especially considering how I have the U.S. national debt clock right in front of me, which is over 27 trillion, 27.8 trillion, soon to be 28 trillion. And I think this is a very important and interesting time, considering socio-political dynamic in the U.S. as well, to talk about how this facade and illusion of stability that system tried to create so hard and at any cost can be brought down by members of a forum. That I believe the last article that I shared with you was how the Goldman Sachs and Interactive Brokers executives are claiming that Wall Street bets trend could take down the system.
Yep.
So what's going on, Peter?
It absolutely could. But the thing is that there is, you put it correctly, there's this illusion of stability, but everything is very, very fragile. And all it really takes is one black swan event to bring everything down. You know, we talked about Raoul Pal, who is a former hedge fund guy. I guess he's still a hedge fund guy, that is a so-called macro investor. And he published an emergency podcast about this, right? That he thought that GameStop business was going to trigger a meltdown. So like on a weekend, he was like ready to see everything fall apart, like on Monday of this current week.
Hey,
And
before we go further,
yeah.
would you describe it for people who don't know what's going on with respect to GameStop? That what happened and what does that imply?
Yeah, so there were these hedge funds that were short selling GameStop. What does that mean? It means they were borrowing the stock and then selling it. So it's not stock that they actually own, but they borrow it to sell it. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because they believe that GameStop is in a tenuous economic position. Why is it in a tenuous economic position? Well, because no one goes to brick and mortar stores anymore. and also because you can download games, you don't have to go to these stores. However, in Reddit, there is a group called Wall Street Bets, and the people in Wall Street Bets apparently felt nostalgic about GameStop and a few other things. So among the things being shorted was not just GameStop, but AMC, the movie theater chain, etc. And they decided, the people in Wall Street Bets, this Reddit group, decided that they were going to fight back, and they were going to buy these stocks in the face of this shorting, this shorting by the hedge funds. And what happened?
The hedge fund has a certain deadline to fulfill the contract that they're obligated to fulfill.
Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. And then they're paying interest, so it's a dangerous thing to short a stock because your exposure is kind of potentially infinite because as long as the price of the stock keeps going up, you have to keep covering your position. And so the Redditors were buying up. They were buying up AMC. They were buying up GameStop, and the hedge funds got their faces melted off. And so they were buying this stuff using Robinhood, and then Robinhood came to the defense of the hedge funds and stopped people from buying any more stocks. So they allowed people to sell these stocks like GameStop, but not to buy them, with predictable results that the price cratered at that point. And then a lot of users, a lot of the clients of Robinhood got burned. It also revealed a certain truth, which is that, they weren't really the clients of Robinhood. They might have thought they were, but the thing is they weren't paying to do any of those transactions. And the first rule of social media and the internet these days is that if you're not paying for the product, who's the product?
Yeah, you're the product.
You're the product, exactly. Yeah. So the deal is that those people that were using Robinhood, they learned the hard way that they were the product. And what was happening is that Robinhood was selling data to hedge funds like Citadel. And as my understanding is that they were not just selling it, but they were selling it in real time so that hedge funds could front run these trades. So that is, if I place a trade or a bunch of my friends place a trade on Robinhood, that data is seen immediately and it's handed to the hedge funds that are into high-speed trading, so they can buy it and then dump on us, right? It's somewhat gross, but it is what it is. And so that was the deal with the Wall Street Bets. And Raoul Pal and some other people in finance, sort of big-time finance people, thought that this could actually be the trigger that could bring down the whole house of cards, because it could have generated a cascading effect. If that hedge fund starts to go under, then it has to start covering its positions. It's got to start selling, and then the worry was that it would initiate a cascading effect of sells that would blow out other positions that are either long and short, and that would yield to more selling, and then eventually we're down to trading with fish hooks and ammunition.
Or crypto.
Or crypto. That was it.
All right.
You either fish hooks, ammunition, canned goods, and crypto.
Yeah. Robinhood, I think it was Robinhood that they also limited the buying ability of Dogecoin.
Yeah, that was another one. Yeah.
Which, first of all, the shorting of stock, Elon Musk tweeted that you cannot sell the house you don't own, you cannot sell the car you don't own, but you can sell the stock that you don't own. But that is not to benefit you as the people. That is to benefit very small group of, that is the definition of elites, basically.
Yeah, there have been people complaining about naked short selling, shorting something that you don't actually hold. It's another thing if you own it and you want to short it because then you're protecting your position. And I think no one is objecting to short selling. They're objecting to this idea that you borrow the stock to short it. And then the really weird thing was that in this GameStop case, it turns out that there was more stock sold than actually existed. So it was like the amount of shorted GameStop was like 1.53 times the amount of GameStop that actually exists. And if you think about it, it's like if that can happen, then you're just in a hopeless situation because people can sell more stock than actually exists. That's just gonna drive you to ruin. And that is the complaint that a number of these people have. I mean, another person who famously complained about this is Patrick Byrne, who used to run, well, I guess he's still principal owner, Overstock.com. I mean, for years he was complaining about people naked short selling on his company.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think what's being disrupted at the core of all of these things is the concept of trust. The trust in a middleman that a lot of people really, you're born into it, that you trust something outside of yourself. It can be family, it can be culture, it can be education that you receive at school. And how you receive that information is interpreted based on the intention and biases of people or the structure that you're a part of or consider you to be a part of it. I use the example of religion. In certain cases, like in Islam, you're born into it and there's no way out of it. And you're assumed as a member of that religion. It doesn't matter if you believe that's a justifiable kind of a thing to do or not. So it seems like, yes, the house of cards is falling apart, but that cannot necessarily be a bad thing if this whole thing has been an illusion.
It will be, I don't know if it's going to be a good thing or a bad thing. It will be a different thing.
Yeah.
The Chinese, it's not a proverb, but it's, what is it? It's an insult. May you live in interesting times.
Yeah, we certainly are.
Well, when the house of cards collapses, we will be living in interesting times. That's for sure. And maybe something better emerges from it, or it's always dangerous because you don't know what you're going to see next. Sometimes in these periods of instability, something pretty terrible can emerge from it, like happened in the first half of the 20th century. We had lots of totalitarian movements emerge from these periods of crisis. And so while the current system is untenable, and it looks like it's quite fragile and could come tumbling down at any minute, I don't think anybody knows what we're going to get next.
Yeah, it's the reason I'm saying it's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't mean that it's a good thing. It's just something that is going beyond dependence on any centralized kind of a structure of authority or trust.
Yeah, see, that's a good point. And I like the trust point because the thing is, we not only trusted these so-called middlemen, but we really didn't have a choice because we need agents of trust in order for me to send money from me to you, for us to engage in any sort of contract. And what's happening with cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance is that these middlemen are being eliminated by trustless contracts, right? Basically by mathematics and computational systems and so forth. So we didn't have a choice before. We had to trust these people, and they didn't really do anything to deserve our trust. Certainly banks did nothing to earn our trust. And now that we have alternatives emerging very rapidly, we may get a very different picture, and we may find that those institutions may be expecting us to continue with our trust, but they're going to be disappointed if that's the expectation.
Yeah. One way to maybe see some kind of a silver lining is that because we are going through this period of disruption, then the solution, which in this case can be decentralization, will be speed up, basically, increase in adoption, because people will begin looking for alternatives. And I think it's a very good argument that cryptocurrencies haven't really address the ease that regular customer need to do their things. Like with banking apps, it's easy, you know, and it took regular people many years to go from going to the actual brick and mortar kind of a bank to use the app. Now, a lot of people made the argument that going from that to, let's say, trading or buying or selling cryptocurrency at this point is not that tangible, and it's not that feasible for majority of people. But I think that will change exactly because of this, because you're seeing that the value of the money that you count on, if it's a US dollar or a Canadian dollar or whatever, it's going down. Bitcoin is going up, for example. And then you wonder, why is this happening? And when you understand the philosophy behind it, at least as much as you need to make sense out of what is happening, then the adoption can happen, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think certainly on the for both institutions and retail, there is a big kind of learning curve here, and people are developing apps that are going to make this easier to do. But those apps are meaningless unless we have something there waiting for us once we get on board. And I think what's really interesting, actually, since we last talked, is the kind of explosion of work that's being done in DeFi and in creating alternatives to banking. So, you know, if you want to get a loan, I mean, it's really an ugly process. If you want to go to the bank and borrow some money, you know, they want to know who you are, they want to know your entire history, they're going to charge you exorbitant rates. Likewise, if you put a little bit of money into the bank, they're not, you know, they're going to give you an interest rate of like, what is it now, 0.06% or something like that. But if you go into DeFi right now, and if you put in money, I mean, they're paying like 10%, 15%. I mean, it varies a lot, but I mean, it's a real return on the money. And more than that, you could easily borrow money. So here's an easy way to do it in some of these platforms. You just put in some collateral in Bitcoin or whatever, and they say, okay, I will loan you 20% of that money. Boom, you make it with the contract, you do it in 10 seconds. You don't have to go talk to a bank officer. You don't have to like go through all the humiliation of applying for it. You've got your Bitcoin, or you've got your Ethereum, or you've got your XRP, whatever you have. You go in, you deposit it in the contract, you take your money, which will be like a US dollar stable coin, let's say, like a tethered US dollar, and take it. You take it out, buy a car, you know? It's that easy. And so once people start wrapping their minds around this, they go like, why was I messing around going to a bank and you know, sitting in waiting for bankers hours? You know, I have to wait for the, you know, the banker to be there, sit in a little stuffy little bank and then talk in this sort of humiliating setting and so forth. No, I'm just going to log on. I can do it. I can write 20 seconds right now. I can do it. I can deposit some Bitcoin. I can take out some US dollar stable coins, and boom, I can go out and buy a car. That's it. It's that simple. And so I, as far as I can tell, the entire U.S. sort of worldwide financial banking system is going to be gone very rapidly, or it's going to have to adapt to this and take it on very quickly. So it might, I know it sounds crazy to say that, but you know, a few years ago you would have thought it crazy to say, well, there aren't going to be any more like record stores, or there aren't going to be any more books, you know, Barnes and Noble bookstores or something like that. Or, you know, if you remember the day when we had travel agents, you had to go somewhere, you went to visit the travel agent. No one does that anymore. They do all that online. Now, all that was done with centralized computing platforms replacing it, and now we're doing it with a decentralized platform. But what we're going to see is that the unraveling that we saw with things like the music industry, the publishing industry, the newspaper industry, for example, all of these things had to radically change because of the internet. Well, now we have another iteration of the internet, and it's coming directly at traditional finance. And things are going to move very, very, very rapidly.
Yeah. I talked about, the app Parler that came out as an alternative to Twitter and all that. I keep
Yeah,
telling people that it was not an alternative because centralization cannot be an alternative for centralization. And as we saw it, they brought the whole thing down within hours. And people are like,
yeah,
oh, they colluded. All right, they did it. What are you going to do about it? There's nothing you can do about it.
yeah. So what we're getting, well, this is the other development now, which is, for whatever reason, people are up, well, for many reasons, people are upset at big tech. And a lot of people, well, Trump supporters in particular lately, have been upset about this, what they perceive to be the censorious nature of Twitter and Facebook, et cetera. And, this will generate a kind of move to these decentralized social media platforms. It's no good to have something like Parler where it's just, one centralized, one guy running the show and everything is sitting there on a Amazon
Yeah.
cloud server or something like that. I mean, it's like there's like one point of failure there. So what we're going to see are uh, these social media applications emerging on the blockchain. I mean, there are a couple of them now. Um, there's one called Voice, which is built on the EOS blockchain, but no one really uses EOS, so no one really knows about it. So they're not here yet, or if they're here, they're just tiny at this point and hidden away. But probably in the next few years, we're going to start seeing these social media alternatives to centralized social media platforms. And these are going to be housed online on the blockchain. So they're going to be more censorship resistant when this happens. So there's a lot going on. It's not just in finance, but probably the blockchain technology is coming for big tech and centralized social media as well.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the concept of trust. Somebody was talking about how this time is similar to when Martin Luther translated the Bible for the first time and allowed ordinary Christians to be able to read the Bible by themselves. Again, going beyond that point of trust and authority that a lot of people would say that he was placed there as a matter of monopolizing on that power, on that divine power. Otherwise, Jesus' message had nothing to do with you have to follow this priest. And even his resurrection had nothing to do with physical resurrection. But all of this was twisted in order for you as a follower to depend on this middleman for hundreds of years until you could really make sense out of the message by yourself.
Yes, that is true. A lot of the relationships of trust that we're in are simply because we don't have a choice. Now, the worry about this is going to be, well, look, we're going to end up trusting somebody here. And the people we end up trusting are probably going to be computer programmers, So someone is going to be writing the code for whatever this alternative to Facebook or Parler ends up being. And someone is going to be writing the code for the new banking system that is going to replace JP Morgan Chase, et cetera. Now, it's true that everything is going to be there and we can all look at it. It's there on the blockchain, written in Solidity code, the Solidity programming language. But are you fluent in Solidity? Am I fluent in Solidity? No. I mean, I guess we could learn it, but for a lot of people like us, we're going to need to trust somebody to tell us that, yes, this code is doing what it's supposed to do. So, I wrote a paper about this some time ago in the early days of Ethereum. And the thought was that these new systems don't actually eliminate trust. They're not exactly trustless, but they reposition trust. They're moving it somewhere else, hopefully in a better direction. But it's important to sort of always be alert to the fact that you have a new boss, as it were, and someone, if not a boss, at least someone in whom you have to place your trust. And the people that you have to trust now are, for at least the time being, are these devs and whatever auditing firms are auditing these online contracts and telling you that they're trustworthy.
Yeah, I think big picture of that is about artificial intelligence. That at some point we have such level and scale of digitization that understanding it and making sense out of it would go beyond human capability. I had a guest, she's working on emotional intelligence for artificial intelligence. And
Yeah.
she was telling me about how their system in their driverless cars, or right now when drivers are driving, they identify 50 plus different emotions and information based on facial expression. That to most people, it's not even, it's invisible. It's just slightest kind of movement. Then my question was that who's making sense out of 50 plus expression per second? Machine has to make sense out of that. And then the
Yeah.
machine context of good and bad, right and wrong is not defined, right? So I think it goes beyond programmers and it gets to what they're called now AI ethicists. That in Google, there is a civil war going on about their AI department, because there are AI ethicists who are coming from certain kind of a worldview, very activist, political minded. And at the same time, it makes me wonder whether or not that would be a disservice to the progress of AI. And it really is, I don't think there's any answer that, are we going to allow artificial intelligence to roam freely and learn based on whatever, and we just merge with it? Or are we going to rely on people who claim that they're actually the righteous ones, they're actually the ones who know what's best for humanity, and allow them to limit this new system, new intelligence, just so it will be aligned with human desires according to them, as defined by that small group of people?
That is an interesting question, right? I actually know somebody who is a philosopher working for Google, and so probably if whoever is doing this work, AI ethicists or whatever, I mean, it's a small group of people, and then you might wonder why we are taking their words for it. And that's
We lost Peter, it seems like. There we go. Right on. Welcome back to Peter Ludlow again.
We're back. So I wanted to say something about AI. And the thing is that not only we're going to have like AI running our cars, for example, but right now in DeFi on the blockchain, we have these decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs or DAOs.
DAOs,
okay?
Yeah.
And so for the most part, there's someone in charge of them. There's some developer that's in charge of like where these things go, and maybe people vote on where they should go. So they're decentralized in a way, but someone is the key holder, right? That's going to actually launch the contracts or do whatever needs to be done with the contracts that are executed on the blockchain by this virtual corporation.
At the inception of it, though, right? Because it will, ultimately it will be automated.
Well, ultimately, yes. But
Right.
the ones that exist now, I mean, someone is driving the car, as it were. Someone is driving that decentralized autonomous organization. So far, they're not really decentralized. They're a little bit decentralized in the sense that there are these governance tokens, and if you own a share of the company, you get to vote on it. But there's nothing that says that the devs actually have to listen to what you're voting on, and sometimes they don't. I mean, sometimes they just do whatever they want to do, okay, even when you're voting. So your little governance tokens are technically, they're inert. However, it is possible to structure this in such a way either that you do your vote actually matters. That is, you're voting on an actual piece of software, right? And there's no developer in the mix there, right? That you have to trust. But an interesting thing happened a few months ago, which was that there was a DAO, which was it was one that was involved in lending money and generating interest on money that you deposited. And something happened where I can't remember if this was an accident or what, but the keys to drive the DAO were accidentally burned. And so so right now there is this decentralized autonomous organization that no one has any control over, and it's going to be living on the blockchain for as long as the internet lives.
Wow.
All right. So
That's
now
wild.
it is wild. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so people can still interact with it if they want to, you know. So you could set up a little AI thing, a learning AI, give it a learning algorithm. You could set up several of these, turn them loose, burn the keys, and you would have these decentralized corporations now that are run by AIs that will outlast all of us.
Yep.
Right? There's no shutting them down, and I find that to be pretty fascinating. Now, no one, as far as I know, there are no ethicists talking about how these decentralized organizations ought to be structured. Well, what I just said is not entirely true, because when you go into the governance groups for these DAOs, there are debates about what should and could be done. And sometimes there are explicit ethical questions that people debate. So there are people that are debating these ethical issues. And it's not like you appoint a committee of ethicists to decide how it should proceed, but the way it proceeds now is that there is a debate. People raise an ethical issue about should we do this or should our DAO do this? And then ultimately there's a vote on it, right? Now, the votes are structured so that the people with the most tokens have the most power, the most voting power. But that at least means that it's not, the ethical decisions are not placed in the hands of a chosen few. You actually have a spot where you debate the ethics of what people are about to do. I tend to find that I'm usually on the losing end of these debates, but it's interesting to engage in. It's sort of philosophy in practice, and it is somewhat decentralized, although the power mostly rests with the people the big whales that have the most tokens, that have the most shares in the decentralized autonomous organization.
Yeah, I think it's obviously philosophy, but it's becoming more and more practical, because the only reason that you would want to have a say, ethically speaking, on any kind of an AI system is if that system is centralized. That would be the ethics and morality within which that system will operate. Because if it's decentralized, then let's say, are you familiar with AGI, right? Singularity Net, Ben Goertzel's?
Yeah,
so his whole thing is we're developing this platform that will give rise to a decentralized AGI. The artificial general intelligence will not be centralized by either Google or US government or a Chinese Communist Party. It will belong to whoever who needs to use it, and it will attain information from all different agents, from millions and millions of different applications that have their own system of governance. And I think this is actually becoming more sensible from now on for most people, because Nevada just passed a bill that would allow tech companies to create governments. They come up with their own basically rules and governance ideals, and which is really interesting. I'm just going to read a little part of it. Plan legislation to establish new business areas in Nevada would allow technology companies to effectively form separate local governments. The zones would permit companies with large areas of land to form governments carrying the same authority as counties, including the ability to impose taxes, form school districts and courts, and provide government services. My mind was blown that this is happening in Nevada in the middle of all of this push for further and further centralized control by a federal government. And here we are, which seems to be very timely and spot on that this is exactly what needs to happen. Now, what will constitute a tech company? That's a different story, because if they can shut down, Parler was a tech company. Who decided that Parler shouldn't exist anymore? So that's a problem.
What do you think? What do you make of this? So say there's some tech company controls my neighborhood. Google takes over.
Right.
I mean, is that a good thing?
Well, Google is doing it right now in part of Toronto, and that is not a good thing because people have no say in it, whether or not they want to live in that area. They already are living in it. They're using everything that they've been using it. But Google has planted this smart city basically to harvest data. And those are the areas that probably social credit system will kick in at first because they have more information on them. But what this bill is saying is that, let's say you and me form a tech company and they consider it to be a tech company. And then we go and buy 200 acres of land and we basically create our own jurisdiction that would have as much power, according to this, as counties. So we can be like, we have our own token. We allow autonomous cars. We allow any kind of transhumanist experimentation and whatever. And people also earn dividend based on their data contribution.
There's an old tradition of this with like company towns. In the 1950s, it was a real phenomenon. There were actually some one of the cases went to the Supreme Court because the company that was in effect running the town was censoring some, I believe they were Jehovah's Witnesses that were out and about, and the company said, no, you can't do that, and we can tell you whatever to do. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that, well, when you're a company town like that, you're taking on all the functions of government, so you have to respect the Constitution of the United States when you get that much power over a community. But it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's a great idea. I would like the idea much better if I knew that the people that were living in these company towns were free to move to another company town. That is, if they could shop for them. That's not always the case. People are bound to certain localities for various reasons. I tend to believe that we are often so concerned about governments and nation states and the power that they have and exercise that we're not always sensitive to the also very dangerous power that corporations can have over us. We're seeing that recently with the power that the tech companies have accumulated. I would be very nervous about tech companies taking control of a local community in the way that we're envisioning here.
Oh, if they're monopolies, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that corporations become monopoly are because of state nations or nation states. That a federal government in
monopoly,
like Google or Amazon, they wouldn't be as gigantic as they are without their elements inside DC. That they try to challenge. What is that Article 230, Section 230? For many, many months, but nobody even wanted to address it. And then you look at how much of, or how many of these people in DC have gotten how much from each of these tech companies, and you realize what the game is really about. It has nothing to do with the consumer.
Yeah, the thing with the tech companies, though, is that it's sort of inevitable. that they are going to accumulate massive power simply because of the network effect.
Yeah.
So the one that has the most network is going to get more nodes. It's going to grow exponentially because the more people that are in the network, the more people that get attracted to the network, and the more powerful the network becomes. So I think that the emergence of these sort of tech giants is not because of anything taking place in Washington, except that nobody did anything in Washington to buffer this effect, and no one has been serious about antitrust legislation for these kinds of companies for a long, long time.
And now they're merging together, the federal government and these tech companies.
Yeah, because when you have a powerful network, the thing you want to be is part of that network.
Yep.
Right? And it's really weird. It's an autonomous kind of process. It's not something where little bald white men are sitting in around a mahogany desk planning this out. Is just a kind of the natural way that things are now organizing themselves when you can create networks so easily with the help of the internet. And so the more powerful the network, it becomes a kind of attractor to other networks. So everyone wants to be part of the Borg, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ability to self-govern, the example that I had in mind was seasteading. You familiar with seasteading?
Oh, yeah.
Concept of creating permanent dwellings at sea called seasteads outside a territory claimed by any government. The term is a blend of sea and homesteading. And homesteading is basically self-sufficiency. That they have their own institute, and because the U.S. Constitution allowed decentralization of governance, and I think it's a really interesting platform, especially when there is a Chinese Communist Party on the other side of the spectrum, to create a contrast. And maybe this will be a push for states to take more control for themselves rather than the federal government. And then there will be smaller tech companies, if they be allowed to emerge and function, that they'll be able to, say, buy 100 acres of land, because land is relatively cheap in the US as well, in the middle of nowhere. And you create your own, or maybe as an objective, you set a DAO that you want to create and move towards that direction little by little.
Well, here's the thing. First of all, we're talking about tech companies like they're here to stay, and I'm not sure that's true. So once you get into things like decentralized finance, is there actually something like a bank that exists? Now, let's just take a platform. There's one called Aave, AAVE, which is developed. The head developer is a guy in Finland, okay? But the other developers are scattered all over the world. So in some sense, it's not really located anywhere. Some of these platforms, no one even knows who the developers are or where they are, right? So, we think of corporations in the sense of, well, they're incorporated, like there's this fiction that there's these embodied things. But once we get to things like decentralized autonomous organizations, they don't really exist anywhere. They don't need to be anywhere. Now, is there any reason for them to buy some land in Iowa, for example, and create a city for the people there? No, there's really no reason for that. Their people could be in Mexico and Estonia and Latvia and Brazil. So then the question is, well, what will corporations look like? I mean, maybe the whole idea of a corporation goes the way of like a tower record store or something like that. They are, we got rid of the brick and mortar things, but maybe we also get rid of the corporation as this embodied individual. It's sort of interesting. I mentioned Aave, which is this Finnish blockchain project, and Aave actually is Finnish for spirit or ghost or something like that.
Cool.
So you have this sort of weird, ghostly organization now that exists. Is it a corporation? Well, it doesn't really exist anywhere. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care who I am. It'll loan us money. We can borrow money. We can loan. We can deposit money with them, and it's all secured by the contract. Do they have any need for land? I don't think so. Do they have any need for a city of some sort?
Yeah, but what if the startup is about building cities?
Okay, so that is an interesting idea. So then, right? So I mean, there are these people that are working on the rethinking of what is a city, and I think I know I am. I mean, I don't have a big enough brain to sort of rethink this. I met an architect who actually works on this. His name was Carlo Ratti, and I think he's at MIT and also in Italy somewhere. And his whole thing is sort of, well, how do you rethink what a city is, for example, in this sort of context? Could you think of cities as being completely diffused and online somehow? Well, what would that mean? Or could you think of a city as being in a virtual world, for example? Or do you want to think of the city as being like a bunch of individuals that have like information flowing between them in some particular way? And now, say you want to build a city where people can live together. I think this is what you're talking about.
Yeah, or a town or a village or a colony, whatever.
Yeah. So build a commune of artists or transhumanists or something like that. I mean, definitely possible. Now the question is, what, with all this new technology and this sort of revolution in our thinking about what is a corporation or what is a city, how will that change what a commune would look like in the future? I mean, I tried to think about this in that book I edited, Crypto Anarchy, Cyber States, and Pirate Utopias. I mean, that was the sort of headline idea. Well, what does a cyber state look like? How are the governance structures created? How does it protect itself? How does it defend itself? How does it protect itself from outside interference and so forth? And I didn't have the answer to those questions then, and I still don't have the answer to those questions.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down to the gridlock of humanity, that we have a tool, we build stuff with it and we destroy stuff with it. And that is like a dilemma at the core of who we are.
Yeah. You think, the internet comes in and you think it's going to be this thing that opens up free expression and liberates us and so forth. And it becomes like the greatest tool for surveillance ever invented, And so the danger is everyone sees all the positive potential that's coming out of blockchain technology and decentralized, autonomous organizations and trustless systems, but we're not very good at anticipating the evil side of these things when they come into existence. And we have this idea of like utopian communities, and the thought is, well, maybe this will make those utopian communities easier to build and sustain. And yes, that's possible, but it's also possible these technologies end up unraveling those kinds of communities and making them harder to construct.
Yeah, absolutely. We just don't know, I guess.
I don't know, yeah.
No, neither do I.
Times, that's the thing, yeah.
There's a group of people who, insist that they do know, and they want to prove it to everyone else.
Yeah, well, they can insist. I mean, that's the thing. Right now, there's so many. I mean, it's exciting that there's so many smart people coming into this space to sort of rethink finance, rethink communities online, and so forth. But when you get really smart people together and they start inventing stuff, at that point it becomes very, very difficult to predict what comes next.
Yeah.
So, in 2007, would you have predicted Satoshi's white paper and the emergence of Bitcoin and all of that? No. When I first saw the World Wide Web for the first time, I thought, what is this? What am I going to do with this? And so, I don't think we saw right away what the internet was going to be about. This is true of all inventions. It goes back to things like the phonograph. Edison thought that his invention of the phonograph was going to be used as a kind of dictaphone so that people could, record things for their secretaries to transcribe, right? He couldn't imagine the entertainment end of that. So we're in this period that's going to be full of lots of inventions, and we don't know what those inventions are going to be. We probably can't know what they're going to be. And as is often the case, it's going to be lots of promise. A promise of dismantling the old order of finance, which has been grotesque in its unfairness. Now the question is, will it construct something better? Will it help bank the unbanked in the world? Will it make easier for people in Nigeria, for example, to get money to start a business? Will it eliminate onerous debts that people have to pay to, when they borrow money? Will it eliminate these incredible expenses to transmit money, for immigrants to transfer money to Mexico, for example, or Guatemala? The rates are outrageous. Will it make the situation better for those people? It has that promise. But my experience with these things lately is with the internet and everything else is that in spite of the promise, there's also always something very creepy and anti-liberating that comes with it, either control or surveillance or some such thing. And so I'm like equal parts excited and equal parts mortified by what is to come.
So as a philosopher, I asked the same question. I'm a neuroscientist. As a philosopher, do you think tyranny is closer to the default state of human nature or liberty? Because I look at children and they're the biggest tyrants ever. And they don't even understand that it's wrong. That, hey, it is what I want. And if you don't give it to me, I'm going to break stuff and cry and do all of those things. It's perfectly normal. There must be some kind of an exterior force to move them away from that kind of a perspective. So I began thinking about tyranny. If you just allow people to go, they move towards tyranny because it's closer to their nature, but it requires foundations and the structures to build to erect liberty, for lack of a better term.
You get this debate about whether people are inherently libertarian or tyrannical or which system they prefer. I tend to think that the natural state is one of flux. Even Plato talked about this. You would get this cycle, from tyranny to this, to oligarchy, to democracy, and then back to tyranny, right? And I think that certain humans are disposed to one system and certain to another, and humanity as a whole kind of oscillates between these two different systems. Now, whether that's good or bad or avoidable, I don't know. But that is the state of things, is that we oscillate between these systems. And we are in a stage of oscillation right now. I don't know exactly what these periods are, but, I'm inclined to say that maybe every 50 years, maybe every 100 years, every 50 years, we got a kind of revolutionary moment. So if you think about 1968, for example, lots of revolutionary periods going on around the world, and then you go back to 1917, 1920s with the rise of totalitarian movements, and you go back to 1848 with uprisings throughout Europe. And so you keep going back to these revolutionary moments. And often these revolutionary moments involve some sort of shift between tyranny and liberty, one direction or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's good and bad. It just is. This is just who we are.
I think it's bad, but but it's like, it's like complaining when it rains on your picnic. I
Right.
can't.
No,
There's
it
not
is.
much I can do about it.
Exactly. Do you think these cycles that you're saying always have had something to do with technology?
That's an interesting thought. I mean, suppose I'm right that there was a revolutionary movement in the late 1960s. Was that because of the emergence of certain media or
No, but also
television?
LSD itself, for example, is technology. I
Oh,
consider
that's
technology anything that quantify an idea.
that's a good point. That could have been a big part of it. Yes, that could have been a big part of it. Yes, and that you're quite correct to call that a technology.
Yeah,
That's
because the way
exactly
I'm
right.
looking at this, we have evolved with and because of our technology. And our technology has evolved with and because of us. But what has
Yeah,
happened is that we evolve linearly, but our technology evolves exponentially. And at some point, I don't know exactly when, but it increased the speed of progress and advancement, technologically speaking, far beyond our capability of being able to catch up with it. That's why I consider smartphones and social media in the hands of humans like monkeys with machine guns. We don't know what to do with them. We're amazed by them. We do whatever we can do with them. But they are just advancing and progressing much, much faster than we do. That's why I think Neuralink is a really, really interesting thing if it's done and implemented in a decentralized kind of a way. Because if it's done centrally, then that would be also the biggest instrument of slavery in human in human civilization.
that would be something. Yes, that would be something. I rewatched our previous interview to prep for this, and we did talk about this, the monkeys with the phones and all that.
Yes.
And I used to think that uh, technology was pulling away from us very, very rapidly, and clearly there's a sense in which it is. On the other hand, if you combine that with this idea, which we also talked about, which was the external theory of mind, right? And if you thought of, well, if you think like David Chalmers does, that your phone is an extension of your mind, then actually, as this phone gets more and more powerful, it is an extension of your mind. It is a part of your mind. So you are growing with that phone,
But if it's not interpreted, if it's interpreted, then it is your conditional mind conditioned on the satisfaction of the person who's interpreting that information. Like when I'm searching for something on Google, if the
Yeah.
algorithm is really going to show me what I would want to see, not what the algorithm's bosses want me to see, then that would be absolutely correct.
Oh, I see. That's an interesting point.
That if I have a bunch of electrodes in my head, and that would, let's say, control when I feel shame and anger, but the rest of the stuff I decide for myself, it will ultimately affect every aspect of my experience.
So if the idea is that, well, here we have this phone, and geez, it is an extension of my mind, but on the other hand, there are these apps on it that are basically using behavioral economics to manipulate me, And so it's like, although it's making me in some sense smarter, it is also taking away my agency and thereby making me dumber at the same time. So it's sort of like it, it's it's taking my mind away in the same sense that it might be adding to it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it creates a matrix. It creates. There's a quote by Gore Vidal that we don't even know what our cage looks like because we've never seen it from the outside. So
Yeah,
when people are not familiar with what is being done to them through information and tailoring of information that is not tailored to them, but it's tailored to some kind of an outside bias and agenda and interest, then they
yeah,
don't realize it. They think that they're making the decision. This is what they like. This is what they don't like. But more you learn about the cage, and when you have the opportunity to peek from outside of it, then I think that's a different story, because throughout history, we've done that. There are people who've peeked outside of the cages, and the simulation that can be social. It doesn't necessarily have to be technological. They peeked from outside of it, and then they brought back certain information and certain rays of light for other people to realize that, hey, what we're experiencing is not all there is. It's a conditioned kind of an experience that has been designed and contained based on the interest and agenda of our betters, superiors.
right. So what would the good version of this story be? That let's say that we didn't have a centralized Apple, we have a decentralized system, and so whatever's software is in my phone, it's completely decentralized. Um, and it's actually, among other things, it would probably pay me for the attention I give to something. It's
Yes,
not
for the
selling
data
my,
that we contribute. Exactly.
yeah, yeah. So it is now I can do all the surfing I want to do. No one's steering me to do it. I'm getting paid to do the surfing. Um, is that am I in a more liberated condition in that scenario?
On the individual basis, I think you are. But nothing will work like that, because it's like we're going to school to be prepared for very specific determined funnels throughout society. We're not going to Montessori school, all of us, that they will tell us, hey, you do whatever you want to do. You want to play, right? Because the society wouldn't operate on that basis.
Well, I mean, this is one of the promises. I don't know if it can keep the promises. I mean, this is one of the promises of blockchain technology and media that would exist upon it, which is that there's no centralized owner of all this. No one. So each individual on there is the owner of the data, right? So you are now free to sell your data for, and that data would be, it's a piece of data that I'm looking at something, right? It's a piece of data that I'm watching Wheel of Fortune on TV, and I can sell that data. No one has any. Let's say no one has any particular. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have it figured out, but there does seem to be that there is a kind of liberating potential in here. Potential.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And technologically, I think we can go beyond all other limitations that has been put on our shoulder because of our, again, I'm not saying it's fully bad or fully good, but when you're born into a culture, there are certain things that are placed on your shoulder for the rest of your life, unless you become conscious of them and make a choice that, hey, I was born in Iran, maybe I like Persian food, but I don't like Persian jealousy, for example, right? But it's been on my shoulder all my life because that's what I learned. That's the society that I grew up in. And then I went to school. They told me certain things that they wanted me to learn in order to serve the bigger context that they had in mind, right? Which they themselves, like teachers and principals and all that, they themselves could have been just on autopilot mode that, hey, this is the right thing to do. This is what we have to do day after day after day after day. And I think this big of a shock to a system is waking a lot of people up to realize that a lot of structures, centralized structures of authorities that they had relied on and identified with, they're basically sandcastles and they're falling
Yes.
apart.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting that you put the point about how we are raised within certain kinds of religious or ethical communities and so forth. I mean, people don't talk about that very much, but like John Stuart Mill did talk about it in On Liberty. He says, well, there are many, many sources of oppression. I mean, it might be a government, it could be a corporation, but it could also be the church. It could just be the mores of the community, just the attitudes of your community can also be a source of oppression.
Your own family.
So, your own family can be a source of oppression, yes. Yeah. So the question is, with these changes that are coming, will that liberate us from the full spectrum of causes of oppression?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think we know the answer of it.
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
We'll have to talk again in a few months. After things fall apart, we'll get together and wow, I never saw that coming.
Yeah, I was watching someone on just a clip from Glenn Beck yesterday. It was an economist. He was talking about the crash of a market is coming within the next 45 days. And he believed that this will be the end of central banks the same way that Catholic Church basically collapsed when it did. That they will lose all control. Because this is a kind of a damage that he was saying we burst the housing bubble in 2008. This is the everything bubble that is going to burst. And it will have a massive effect on all these institutions.
It will be very interesting if all the central banks go under.
Yeah.
Whether that could happen, I mean, I don't know. There's stirrings of this, you know. I mean, you do have alternatives now. We do have Bitcoin out there. You don't need to rely on someone to print money for you.
Yep.
So maybe the age of sovereign currencies is coming to the end.
Yeah. This reminds me of what Buckminster Fuller said, that it's basically pointless to fight an existing system. You build a better alternative that make the existing system obsolete. Bitcoin is the best example of that.
Yeah. You don't tear apart the boat you're on unless you have a better boat to get on. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we will see if these blockchain protocols and the decentralized finance really work out, then things are going to get very, very interesting very fast, because then we're going to have clear alternatives to the financial system, and there will be a real question about whether we need central banks at all.
Yep. Hey, let's talk just briefly. I know we've been talking, gone on and off, so for a while. This tokenization and decentralization that we're talking about, we mainly talked about in finance, but it goes well beyond finance. For example, there was an example of a Manhattan apartment, a $30 million real estate property in Manhattan that got tokenized with blockchain. And now what is happening is the crypto art scene with NFTs. They're non-fungible tokens.
Exactly.
And it's mind-blowing and amazing. Would you explain a little bit of what is going on with that respect in the world of, for example, digital art and the potential of this thing moving forward?
Sure. The basic idea is that you can tokenize anything. So the best example of NFTs, non-fungible tokens, is, if you remember CryptoKitties.
Yes.
Where you
I had a bunch of them.
These little, do you have CryptoKitties? Yeah.
I don't know. I don't even know if I can go back to the site because when it came out, I got a bunch of them and traded, and I haven't used it in like maybe 2 years.
Do you remember your wallet address?
No.
They're probably still in your
They
wallet.
must be. Yeah.
So there were these cats, and you could breed them, and then it was sort of using some algorithm that would generate new cats, and then you they each of them is identifiable. There's only one such cat because it's sort of like linked to a location on the blockchain, as it were. And it's like, and it also shows that I own that CryptoKitty. So, someone could like obviously Photoshop or do a screen capture and create a cat that looks just like mine, but it's not my CryptoKitty. So I could create a work of art likewise, and I know the ownership is determined in the blockchain itself. I own this piece of art. Now, someone could do a screen capture of that. They could send it out, but I'm the one who owns the quote unquote official one.
Yep.
Just like you can have lots of you could have lots of copies of the Mona Lisa, but there's only one. Similarly, we can show this ownership on the blockchain. And it is. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to track these crypto artists that are creating these NFTs, and some of them are really cool. If you on Twitter, you can follow a bunch of them, and they'll show you their work. I'm tending to not follow them because then I want to spend money on them, and it gets to be an expensive hobby. Now, in the real estate case, the idea is that I could, let's say, buy a building that's $30 million. Well, no, before we get to that, let's go to artwork. Let's say that someone wanted a painting that's $30 million. We could tokenize that. We could split up the token, right? So that I could have like 0.1% of this painting, right? So someone could have a fancy painting. None of us can actually afford it, but we could all get together and own like some sort of share. How do you know that I own it? Well, it's right there on the blockchain. Now, the reason this is interesting in real estate is because if you live in a part of the world other than, say, the United States and certain very developed countries, the issue of title to property is not always clear. So here in Mexico, for example, there are lots of little title companies all over the place. They're called notarios. And they keep a record of who owns what. But they're not always honest players, right? So if some narco goes into the office and says, you're going to give me that land, and then, they'll just change it, and that's it, okay? So the question is, we have this really obsolete system for keeping track of who owns what. Well, what if you move that to the blockchain, right? So that everyone on the blockchain can see, well, anyone with access to the blockchain, which means everybody, can look and see who owns what property, when they bought it, who they bought it from, how much they paid for it, etc. All of that information is in this kind of immutable record. Now that I'm talking to someone here next week about this because they're working on a deal in Mexico where they have some real estate investments that they want to tokenize in exactly this way, put it on the blockchain, let people buy a fractional share in certain kinds of property on the Caribbean coast here. Okay, so any sort of thing could have a tokenized representative. So any sort of stock, for example. So one of the things that people have done is create virtual versions of GameStop, Tesla, and so forth, so that you can trade these synthetic versions of these assets. You don't have to trade the quote-unquote real world version of it. You can trade the synthetic version of it. And the synthetic version uses oracles to track the price of the so-called real world version of the asset.
Wow.
So that allows some very speedy trading, right? So like it's not a big process. I have to go to my broker. I don't have, you and I could just swap these things right now. I'll give you my Tesla for you give me your GameStop. Boom, we do it right like that. So what's going to happen is that there are these exchanges, distributed exchanges. No one owns them, right? Uniswap is one, is a prime example, and people are trading crypto on those, but you could trade anything. You can trade a tokenized version of anything on it. You could trade real estate on it. You could trade stocks on it. You could trade anything that's tokenizable, which is basically anything. So one thing you could do is, like, you say you see an artist on YouTube, for example, or I don't know, Twitch or anywhere, right? And you see an artist and you really like this artist, and what you could do is buy a share in that artist, right? The artist could issue tokens, and I'm going to buy in now, right? Because we're betting on the future of that artist. So artists and performers could tokenize themselves in order to raise money or to get and then people, early people that find these people early, right, could ultimately benefit from that. So it's like finding a small cap corporation or a small cap crypto early, right? So lots of possibilities. And so the way we engage with artists, the way that artists get paid, the way that stocks are traded, the way all of these things are going to radically change. It's a much more radical revolution than we got with the internet. I mean, it's the most radical revolution we've seen in a long time. I mean, maybe since the invention of agriculture. I mean, it's at that level. So you're going to have like invention of agriculture, I suppose the Industrial Revolution, the internet maybe, but I think this sort of blockchain technology is much bigger than the internet, because it actually changes how it sort of tears apart these silos where all the information was kept. It tears apart the silos where all the power was stored and distributes that. And as I said, it's very promising, but like always, we don't know where the danger is yet.
Yeah, because the other side of it are powers who are losing power as a consequence of this revolution. Yeah. So they will do anything they can. It's like a movie, and the good characters and bad characters. What are the bad guys going to do now? So what do you think are the bad guys going to do?
That would be very interesting. I mean, one of the things you do is you try and throw regulations at people. You can try and ban Bitcoin. You could try and ban, countries try to ban cryptocurrencies. We'll see if that works.
Yeah.
Or you try and regulate them. Or so, one of the things that people will try and do is absorb it. A lot of these banks are going to be sitting on top of the blockchain very soon. They're going to get permission to do things on the blockchain. And so then what happens when they enter that game? Because they're not going to die. They're not going to say, we're going to go away. No, they are going to, once they can't beat it, then they're going to try and absorb it somehow.
Yeah, very interesting decade ahead.
Yes,
very interesting. Since you listened to the last episode we talked about, have you changed your mind about the last question, the alien?
I love my last question. I love my answer to the last question.
Okay, right on.
Yeah. I forgot what it was though, but I remember that I love it. So the question was,
if you come across,
what's the best thing and the worst thing
of humanity? Yeah.
Of humanity. And
what do you think now?
I'm trying to remember.
Let's see if it's the same.
The point was that the best thing was also the worst thing. That's all I remember that I said.
Yeah.
But what is it that I said that was the best and the worst?
I can't remember,
thing?
but I tell you this. You and two other guests, like three right after each other, they said something that it was also the best and the worst. And for me, it was really interesting. It was because I was thinking about dropping the question. I got myself to a point that there is no good and bad, but it depends on the perspective and the context. But
Yeah.
you guys, three of you, and all three prominent people, but from different fields, it was like, this thing is the best one, but it also can be the worst one.
Yeah. Dude, I wish I remembered what I said because was really impressed with myself for whatever it was I said.
But hey, it's
I'll,
exactly what
I'll
we
have to
talked.
rewatch I'll have to rewatch the interview.
Yeah, exactly what we talked about. I think throughout this episode, that what all these promises that are brought because of technology can also lead to very nightmarish, hellish kind of places. So the spirit carries on, I think, from that episode to now.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a hell that we can't even imagine yet.
Yeah, we
That's
don't
the
know what we don't know. That's the most
yeah,
important part.
yeah.
All right, man. This
No,
was,
at least we know what we don't know.
huh?
At least we know what we don't. Well, probably don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What did they say? That there are things we know we know. There are things we know we don't know, and there are things we don't know that we don't know.
yeah.
And I think that's
That's where we
most of
are. That's where we are.
that's most of what's out there. We don't know what we don't know.
Yeah, we're gonna find out some of it.